On October 18th, 1896, New Yorkers who went to pick up their New York Journal encountered the lascivious smile of a man dressed in evening clothes, with a woman writing on his chest, "Meet me in the Sunday Journal." Meet me Sunday in the Journal. And meet him they did. The American Humorist, which was the comic supplement of the Journal, brought in waves of new readers and marked one of the fiercest volleys in the circulation wars during the last decade of the 19th century. And one of the questions I'd like to ask is, how did this man get on the front page of the paper, and why was he smiling? Comic strips in general just emerged in the urban newspapers of the 1890s and became a syndicated feature of newspapers by the 1920s. So between those 30 years, they grew, and they represent a cultural shift that America underwent during that period from a Victorian, genteel, community-centered society to a consumerist, urban, and bureaucratic one. And this happened both in the production of the strips. The shift happened both in the production of the strips and in their reception. Comics both portrayed leisure and were leisure. And this was made possible only by the large-scale acceptance of leisure in the community at large. In comics, early comics, the characters tended to be combative outsiders, battling against acculturated middle-class citizens. The portrayal of Irish immigrants, for instance, is an example. You move from the anarchic street urchin, the yellow kid, through the failing efforts of happy hooligan to live up to social expectations, finally to the upwardly mobile Maggie and Jiggs in bringing up father. And what this meant was that workers had to develop a time discipline. They had to learn how to be at work at a certain time and then do work according to a clock. And this wasn't true in the rural life, but industrialization required this. So you got a division of your day into work and life. And as the number of free hours available rose, a variety of activities also sprung up to fill those increased hours. Reading was one such activity. Because of technologies of printing distribution, the advancements made in those technologies, the number of publications available for people to read rose, and so did their literacy rate. For northern artisans, the literacy rate was about 89% in the 19th century, and for northern farmers and laborers, it was about 76%. So there was a high rate of literacy. Workers tended to read at home, in a family setting, at work, and one of the interesting things they did at work is they'd pay one worker to read while the others worked. And they also read while they traveled. Reading can be divided in the Civil War period into the categories sensational and genteel. Sensational fiction was dime novels, story papers, cheap libraries. The genteel stuff tended to be in respectable magazines like The Atlantic and in novels of manners. Newspapers made up an important source of reading materials as well. During the 1830s, there was the penny of control. Okay, the comic strip industry generally followed this pattern, but the struggle in comic strips was less contested, partially because the reading of comic strips did not require physical space the way other ones did, and so there wasn't an actual physical space to fight over. Also, the difference in comic strips is that you can easily detach parts of the newspaper, just physically. And so if you want to ignore the comics, they're easy to ignore. And also, in a comics page, you can choose which ones you want to read. Right now, for instance, I just read Calvin and Hobbes, Doonesbury, maybe The Far Side. That's it. The same thing was true back then. There were still middle-class characters in strips like Jimmy Swinnerton's Tigers and Mr. Jack or Richard Olcott's Buster Brown. These characters were less violent and frequently nonviolent. And so middle-class readers could just ignore the ones they wanted to ignore. Lower-class readers could ignore the ones they wanted to ignore. Also, it should be noted that the New York Times has never carried comics. And since it's the paper of the respectable middle classes around the turn of the century and the self-proclaimed paper of record, if one only read the Times, one never read comics. And therefore this socially contested space didn't occur to just a Times reader. Now, comic strips did come under attack from the same middle-class reformers that addressed attention to many other leisure activities. In 1908, there was a general movement on the part of progressive reformers to control mass entertainments, especially in movies and comics. For instance, the Boston Herald dropped its comic supplement in 1908 because of numerous letters to the editor criticizing comic strips. And this met the approval of conservative magazines like The Nation, Outlook, and Lippincotts. Other papers in Milwaukee, Indianapolis, and New York dropped their comic supplements. Some newspapers, like the Christian Science Monitor, tried to create clean comic strips. The syndicates that arose in the early 20th century doomed that movement to reform the comics. By 1914, all these papers that had dropped their comic supplements suffered drops in circulation as a result, and therefore restored their comic pages to their papers. And the reason was that the syndicated strips which were coming out of New York were so popular that everyone stopped buying papers that weren't carrying them. But also during this time, between the 1890s and the 1920s, comics moved towards respectability. By the 20s, a national popular culture of film, radio, sports, and comics had emerged and introduced an element of standardization into American culture. And the syndicates played the greatest role in standardizing American comic strips. First of all, they were sold to papers across the country, and since they could pay more, they got the better strips, and they became popular, and everyone jumped on the bandwagon, basically. Syndicates also tended to guide cartoonists in the content and tone of their strips. An example of this is Joseph Patterson, who was at the Chicago Tribune. He told Sidney Smith to change Old Doc Yak, which was an animal strip, into the Gumps, which was a lower middle-class family in Chicago. And the Gumps became one of the longest-running strips in comics history. Cartoonist Amran Schoenfeld commented that there was no question of morals here. It was chiefly a matter of dollars and cents. So the editors wanted to appeal to the widest variety of readers, and so they tended to make the strips more respectable. And this shift towards respectability can be illustrated by the portrayal of the Irish in popular comics from the 1890s to the 1920s. The Yellow Kid, 1895 to 1899, was an Irish slum child, had a heavy accent, and he roamed the city barefoot, disrupting customary activities of middle-class citizens. Happy Hooligan, 1899 to 1932, tried to hold down jobs and to encourage proper social behavior in others, but his efforts always failed and usually produced chaos. Bringing Up Father, 1913 and 1965, told the adventures of Jiggs, a hod carrier, which carried bricks, who won the lottery, and his wife Maggie, who tried to get him to meet the standards of upper-class decorum, dress, and behavior. Jiggs constantly failed to meet these standards, but the strip's humor arose from the social embarrassments and comic misunderstandings that these efforts produced, rather than the anarchy and physical comedy of the earlier strips. This progression demonstrates the shift in respectability of the comics. While anarchy and anarchic comedy has remained popular in comics throughout and still remains popular today, and Calvin is an example of an anarchic character. By the 1920s, anarchy had calmed down. Most of the strips created during that decade, from the Gumps to Blondie to Gasoline Alley, featured families working to get along in a modern commercial society. Even the adventure strips, which came about at the end of the 20s, featured characters openly supportive of the social order, whether it's Captain Easy in Wash Tubs, Buck Rogers, or Dick Tracy. They all supported the social order. The lead characters were trying to expand American ideals and control threatening outsiders, rather than trying to disrupt those same ideals and work anarchy from within. The smiling man who greeted the journal's readers on that Sunday morning was emblematic of the coming humor that comics would bring to their readers every Sunday morning since. The emergence and development of comics did not just happen. Key individuals contributed creativity and capital to that process. The audiences found that they greatly enjoyed the strips, and the comics have proved popular ever since. In the first 3 decades of the comic strips, we can see the way America changed around the turn of the century. Thank you.